Welcome back to the channel, everybody. So today we're going to talk about a topic that I think is pretty interesting. And if you haven't seen the recent Jedburgh podcast with the Sergeant Major of the Army, he made some comments on that podcast about how he's seen a lot of combat, but he's never seen actual war. I've had a lot of people asking me about this and asking me about my perspective on it. So that's what we're going to do in the video today. Now, first thing we're going to do is just show you the clip of the Sergeant Major of the Army talking about this, and then I'll give my opinions and perspective on it. Now, before we do that, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe on the video. It really does help. And if you want to support the channel, go ahead and grab yourself some merch, hat, t-shirt, whatever. All right, now let's jump back into the video. So again, first thing we need to do, watch the video, and then we'll do a breakdown on it. All right, check this out.
And then I think the biggest thing we need to remind the GWOT generation is, and I use myself as an example, I have a fair amount of combat, maybe a little more than the average individual. I've never been to war. Not war like we're talking about, large-scale combat operations with a near peer. And if you haven't watched the Pacific series lately, you know the difference between going to combat and then coming back and going to the KBR gym in the KBR chow hall and salsa night on a Wednesday. That is not war. And so I think, and Seac Black and I really appreciate how he articulates that. The generation we're trying to develop now to understand why readiness matters, you know, so that we never remove the term near peer in the term near peer. This is a potential to change the American way of life, and believe me, I don't want to discredit the GWOT generation, because boy, we did some things for our nation that most people they'll never know, they'll never understand. They'll continue to sleep blissfully, peacefully in their beds, but that's not large scale war.
All right, so kind of an interesting topic, right? War, combat, are they the same thing? Are they different, right? I think the first thing that we need to do before we talk about anything on this is define some terms, okay, for this to really make sense what he's talking about. Now, if we go by the textbook definitions of war and combat, right? So for war, basically a conflict carried out by two nations, two parties, armed conflict, right? Where combat is simply the fighting portion of the physical act of fighting during a war. All right. Now, by actual definition, has the Sergeant Major of the Army seen war? Yes. Has he seen combat? Yes. Okay. Now, I'm not here to play semantics. I know what he's trying to say, and so that's what we're going to do. Okay. I'm going to explain this. Now, a couple different things here. The textbook definition of war, right? If America actually went by that, we would have been in a lot more wars than we officially have. Now, the American, say, government definition of war, okay, is only when we have formally had Congress declare war on another nation. Everything else is a conflict, right? So, for those of you who didn't know, America hasn't been to war since World War II, okay? The Korean War wasn't a war. The Vietnam War wasn't a war. Desert Storm was not a war. Global War on Terror wasn't a war, by definition. Okay, so yes, if we're going by the American sort of government definition of war, has anyone in the Global War on Terror seen war? No, because World War II was the last time it happened. Now, what the Sergeant Major of the Army is more saying is that he hasn't seen large-scale peer-to-peer war, much like we saw in World War II between America, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, right, Japan, okay? The Global War on Terror was what? It was a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism conflict, okay? So I want to talk about some of the things he said here and give sort of my perspective on it, right? So again, he says, I've seen a fair amount of combat, but I've never seen war. And he says, I don't want to sort of discredit the Global War on Terror veterans, okay? You kind of are by doing that, right? You're making the assumption that the soldiers in World War II, perhaps, and don't get me wrong, greatest generation, amazing, right? That they somehow saw infinitely more combat or gunfighting than veterans in the global war on terror did. Not necessarily true, actually, okay? Now, World War II had some much bigger individual battles, right? D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, things like that. However, the global war on terror had some massive combat battles as well. If it would be hard pressed for you to tell a young private who fought in the entire Battle of Fallujah that he's never seen war, but a World War II veteran has, that's kind of a stretch to me. Okay. Now, also keep in mind, from a soldier perspective, the soldiers in World War II, they didn't see the war either. They saw combat, right? All combat is, all war is a culmination of combat that has happened, right? And kind of usually whoever wins the most of those combat operations, and eventually is going to win the war. Not always the case. But my point is that all soldiers see combat, right? From a top looking down perspective of war, none of us really see that, all right? So, yeah, I think it's discrediting, especially the early global war on terror veterans. If you look at, the battles of Fallujah, Ramadi, things like that, that's pretty goddamn close to war comparatively to World War II as well, right? Now, also, if you think about the amount of time, okay, difference between World War II. So most soldiers in World War II, right, they deployed to war. They came back home when the war was over, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean they spent every single day in combat, right? They actually, on average, didn't really spend any more time in combat than a lot of the global war on terror veterans have. I've got buddies that did 5, 6 combat deployments who actually spent more time in combat than any World War II veteran did. Okay, no knock on either one. My point just is, right, trying to sort of make it sound like, this generation, global war on terror fighters have never seen war. I know, I get what you're doing here, but it's a little disingenuous, in my opinion. Now, another thing he says in here, okay, and this is really where he's guiding it to. He says, in the combat we saw, you went to combat and then you came back home to the chow hall later for surf and turf or whatever. This is true in like the last 3 years of the global war on terror, okay? From like 2017, 2018, myself included, on that deployment, yes, we were flying in on helos, point target raids. We were doing counter-terrorism, okay? But if you go back a little bit further, right, and even to like 2013 times, we were still doing VSO operations. Like, Green Berets were living out in the middle of nowhere, in villages, fighting all the time, okay? There was no going back to the chow hall. It was shitty living war conditions, all right? So to talk about like the entire global war on terror was this thing where you just kind of flew in, did operations, and flew back out to the chow hall, very tiny portion of the global war on terror was that actually the case. When the war was pretty much over, the Taliban had given up, we had defeated ISIS, there was really just no more fighting to be done, okay? But the guys who, again, fought in the Battle of Fallujah and things like that, yeah, they didn't go home to the chow hall after each gunfight, okay? So again, I can't really agree with him on this either. So, now, where he talks about in here that, he's never seen a war where so large scale that an entire nation has to be mobilized, which, like in World War I and World War II, that was the case. Here, I definitely agree with this, okay? The global war on terror was definitely not that at all. Now, it became very large scale, even to the point where, we enacted the stop loss, recalled soldiers back in. It got almost to the point where we enacted the draft. Most people don't actually realize that. The only reason the draft didn't happen is because when we needed it was during election year, and it would have been political suicide. But part of, I think, the biggest problem in America today, and sort of all the disrespect towards veterans, and again, this has happened in history after Vietnam and whatnot now, but especially right now, okay? With the botched withdrawal of Afghanistan, things like that, Americans don't give a shit about veterans. They don't care about the sacrifices they made. You might think, yes, they do. No, they don't. Or 81 million people wouldn't be about to vote for a candidate who basically pissed in everybody's faces, and hung us all out to dry in Afghanistan. Okay, they don't care about veterans. But part of the reason why, comparatively to the World War II generation, that America doesn't give a shit about its veterans or its military, is that they didn't feel the effects of the global war on terror. We did, the veterans and our families, we carried the entire burden of that. What do I mean by that? You didn't have to, like, rescale your entire economy, everything towards the war, okay? The average person in America, if they didn't pay attention, have no idea what was even happening, zero effect on them, zero effect on their daily lives, zero effect on their families, okay? And because of that, that is a big reason why I think the World War II generation got much better taken care of as a society, more unified, all these things, whereas in this generation, global war on terror, again, people don't care, okay? Some people do, of course, but the vast majority of veterans don't. Like, look at the fact that who the vice president candidate is on the left, right? A serial stolen valor committer, slap in the face of all veterans, lied about being a combat veteran multiple times, lied about having PTSD from combat, right? So people don't care. That's just the reality of it. Now, he gets into talking here, which I think is, we need to sort of look forward, and he's kind of forecasting a little bit. And he talks about how the next generation is they're never going to let them forget the term near peer. What does that mean? Near peer is essentially our adversaries that are close to as well equipped as us or fighting force as the United States military. So, excuse me, China, Russia, Iran maybe, these could be considered near peer threats. They are near to our level of military that we would have to fight, okay? First world nations, much like a war like Ukraine, Russia, okay? That is a peer-to-peer fight. Now, why is he saying that the next generation is never going to have, or will never forget about this? I think what we're talking about here in forecasting is he, like I believe, that the next war, I think, is right around the corner, and this is what he's referencing, and it's going to be massive peer-to-peer, okay? China invades Taiwan, we get involved formally against Iran or Russia, things like that. That will be a very, very different war or conflict than the global war on terror would be, okay? The weaponry used, our ability to actually fight, right? We can't just fly in on helicopters and hit targets and do point target raids and things like that. Completely different. So, I understand what he's saying here, and I do agree that I do think that is where we are headed as a nation. Now, is America and the American military prepared to fight that next conflict? Well, that's going to be the topic for the next video, because that is an entire can of worms on its own that we kind of have to unpack, right? But overall, war, combat, all these things. Again, I think we're kind of playing semantics a little bit. What I would say is, the way I look at it, sort of the first half of the global war on terror was pretty close in a lot of ways to what we consider a actual war. For those of you who don't know, the Iraqi army, actually incredibly powerful, right, comparative, before we destroyed their entire air force before we got involved. They had a pretty strong military, okay? Not necessarily peer-to-peer, fairly close in some regards. But the first half of that war was more of your, how I would kind of define a typical war. Now, the back half of that, definitely, especially in Afghanistan, what we were doing was counterterrorism, okay? I agree with him. I wouldn't consider that a war. Point target, raids, things like that. A lot of combat, but, large scale peer-to-peer conflict, that's not what that was. So I'm not going to disagree too much on that. But overall, yeah, I think, again, it's kind of just how are you going to define things based off of if you're going to talk like this. But I do think it's something that we've talked about in the military and the global war on terror for quite a bit, is this an actual war? By the end of it, I'll say in 2018, no. We were definitely, again, flying in, pouring target raids, drug busts, taking out terrorists, doing things like that, counter-terrorism. So, yeah, that'll probably wrap it up for this one, guys. And again, I'll dissect sort of where I think the American military is at, and are we ready to get involved in a massive peer-to-peer level war? Well, we'll find out. Also, guys, I've done quite a few different videos. I just did one recently on some things that were said by a certain political party regarding the election. Tried to put it on YouTube. That video was immediately demonetized and shadow banned. Anything I've said about a certain political party, those videos are immediately targeted, censored, shadow banned, demonetized. So what I've decided I'm going to do, no point for me to try to put them out on this channel. Eventually they're just going to shut the channel down because there's no free speech on this channel. But I'm going to have all those videos over on my Patreon. All right, so I don't have to worry about it there. Talk about whatever we want. So if you're interested in that side of things, things that are just going to get banned here, then feel free to check out the Patreon. So that's going to do it for this one, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.